Hello, there you are. Looking forward to talking today a little bit about what to do when you're over involved and overwhelmed. So, this is a question that keeps coming up over and over in book readings and presentations and workshops that I'm doing. So, people who have come to recognize that the way in which they're engaging, that they're enmeshed, and they wish they were in a compassionate witness framework or stance, and they're not, and they want to know what to do about it. I get that feeling because it's super overwhelming and uncomfortable once you recognize that it's not a sustainable way forward and you want something different. And for so many of these relationships, particularly when they're in our family relationships or work relationships, they're not necessarily something that we can always back out of simply. And I would say in almost all those enmeshed relationships, you can't quite back out of them simply because we've made some sort of commitment by our behavior or by our words to keep up this pattern or this way of acting, and which is over involved. So a little bit ago, I had a painful and devastating experience myself of finding myself yet again over involved and overwhelmed. Story of the life, right? And there I was trying to take a look at my part about how I got there and wondering what some of the clues were as to how I got there. And so I could not repeat this again. So I wrote some notes to myself, which I want to share, which is that I noticed I was not telling the whole truth about the relationship to people. So I would package it up in a way that would feel more palatable when I talked about it, because I had become quite aware of how unhealthy I was and how over involved I was. And so to avoid having to deal with that, I packaged it up and I didn't tell the whole truth. And that way I could keep the status quo and keep the other person's happiness, because I didn't want to flag that something was up. I totally recognize my bitterness and resentment that unfortunately in this situation had gone on for quite some time. I'm working harder than the other person towards this goal that's supposed to be benefiting us both. I started to believe this other person owed me something for all I had invested. I found my ego seeking some sort of recognition for what I had done and how I had sacrificed. And then when I found myself fully explaining what was going on as I tried to get support for myself about how to engage differently, I felt embarrassed and trying to explain the way I was behaving in this relationship to a new person, or to someone like outside of the story who hadn't been in the story with me for a long time. And ultimately, I came to recognize that I didn't like who I was, which is a super painful realization, because in my bitterness and resentment, I could make it all about the other person and what had happened. But when I really come to sit with what was happening and look at it, I recognized that I didn't like who I was. And that it was a painful truth to reckon with, and the piece that really helped me to make the change. So then what do we do when we find ourselves in these over involved and overwhelmed relationships? And so one, I think it's super important to acknowledge that it's awesome that we recognize it. Like, that's the first step. And in so many ways, in so many scenarios, just recognizing it can help make that shift start to happen. So sometimes just recognizing it, we're reconfiguring how we respond and how we word things. That already can shift things. So bravo. And for some relationships, it takes more concrete steps than that. So for me, I had to get quite a bit of support to really understand what was the healthiest path forward and what was the path that was for the higher good, both for me and the other person. Because of course, if I sat in my bitterness and resentment, I think of these, unattractive or really unhealthy ways to respond. And I didn't want to do that either. That's not who I wanted to be in the world. But then I couldn't figure out another way besides this pattern that had solidified itself over time. So I think tips are getting support and talking with enough people until you can find the right way for you. Only you know the path forward, and only you live with the consequences. only you know all the ins and outs of this story. Not every other person does. So getting support is super key. And I did a lot of writing and journaling to really own my part and understand how and why I had become enmeshed in this way. And also in that process of writing and reflecting, I was able to be really gentle with myself about the part of myself that was deeply hurt and sad that the relationship was going to change, because there obviously we don't start out in these relationships hoping this will happen, and that had not been my intention. So I was also grieving and sad that something was going to change about the relationship. So that is also helpful to give space for our grief. Another important way to move forward is to outline the steps that we're going to take and what support we need with each of those steps. So ultimately, this, I came up with a super clear plan, and thank goodness for super supportive friends and professional help folks. So if that's a therapist or if that's someone in your work HR program, depending on the scenario, but I was able to really garner some support as I practiced what my next steps were. And I will tell you that I practiced over and over the things that I was going to say and how I was going to change my behavior. And I wrote down the pieces and I worked on the words until I really could feel that it was for my higher good and for the other person's higher good. And learning from me from this too, as I spent this time reflecting and figuring out how to shift into a healthier place, it's like, well, what can I do different next time? And some advice I got from a coach that's been so helpful is I would reflect to her, hey, so sometimes it takes me 24 or 36 hours after an interaction to recognize really how off something is, or how wrong it is for me, or how it's really not a sustainable way forward. But then 24 or 36 hours later, it feels too late sometimes to deal with it, and you just keep moving on with life. And so as part of my doing work with my empathy adventures and learning to recognize my body's clues and myself better, I couldn't realize I actually do get clues in the moment. I just am not sure. I haven't processed it, and I don't quite know what to say or how to deal with it. And so the coach gave me this great advice. When you get that clue from your body, she said to me, what would it be like for you to say, I can't quite name it, but something's off for me right now. I just want to flag that for future reference. And it's so freeing, and ultimately acknowledges for my own self the experience I'm having. But I've also done this now sometimes in group settings, and someone else in the group has said, oh yes, me too, and then chimed in, and we've been able to have these healthier conversations in the moment. Or the other person has replied back, oh, I can see why you feel like something's off. This is what it is for me. Is it that for you? So this has been a really helpful tip for me to try to avoid getting myself in that over-involved place that's so easy and a frequent way those of us who are super empathic and givers can be, and at least slow down that process so that I give myself the 24 to 36 hour space that I know I need to process and really figure out what next steps are. I would love to hear from you. What are your tips or ideas? One, for noticing and kind of chronicling for yourself that you're over-involved and overwhelmed. What are some strategies you have for backing yourself up out of it? And then are there things that you've learned that help you flag in the moment that something's not quite right, so that you can put yourself on a healthier path for moving forward? Thank you for being here.